faith, firearms, freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode 23, the Father's Day edition. Happy Father's Day to all of the fathers out there listening. Today's episode brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Check out cooksholsters.com. Use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and get 15% off everything in the store. That's cooksholsters.com. Today we've got a very special episode for you. Pastor Bennett, my co-host for the Clinging to God and Guns segment, proposed that we do something a little bit different with our segment this week. Typically, we take an article that's written by a liberal Christian using scripture to support gun control, and we fisk it line by line. Well, Pastor Bennett suggested that we talk about the proper Christian response to the shooting in Orlando last weekend. And from there, we came up with the idea to focus the entire show on the Orlando shooting and to involve all three of the show's contributors, Pastor Bennett, Sergeant Bill, and Aaron Israel. So, today's show is a little bit different, and I hope you'll find it informative. It's packed with a lot of information and perspective on the shooting and its aftermath that, sadly, we're not getting from the national media or our national leaders. Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense will join me to talk about responding to an unexpected critical event like the shooting in Orlando. Pastor Bennett and I will discuss the Christian response to Orlando and how we as Christians are called to love our neighbors in the LGBT community, even as we're demonized by many of its members and the media, keeping in mind that love and acceptance are different things. And then, for the first time on Armed Lutheran Radio, all three of our contributors will be together at the same time to discuss the shooting, its aftermath, gun control, and the ways that we could actually do something about gun violence and terrorism in the future. I hope you enjoy the show, and will share this very special episode of Armed Lutheran Radio, which comes your way right after this.
It's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs. I'm Alan Gottlieb, founder of the Second Amendment Foundation. When someone says we don't need that kind of gun, remind them the Founding Fathers determined what rights our Constitution should protect. There's a world of difference between rights and needs. It is not the function of government to tell us what we need or what we don't. Certainly no one needs an assault rifle or a Saturday night special, or for that matter, no one needs a Corvette with a high-capacity horsepower engine capable of speeds to 150 miles per hour. But in the hands of honest, responsible individuals, we have the right of choice. We have the right to read books others don't like. We have the right to listen to any radio program we choose. We have the right to dress the way we want to. We also have the right to own firearms of our choice. So the next time someone tells you, you don't need something, tell them it's the Bill of Rights, not the Bill of Needs. Join the Second Amendment Foundation today so that this message and our Bill of Rights might live. Call 425-454-7012. That's 425-454-7012.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Our good friend Aaron Israel from Fundamental Defense joins us again, and we are dedicating this entire show to the terrible shooting in Orlando that happened Sunday morning. First off, Aaron, just your initial reaction to, when you first heard about it. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say my initial reaction, being a believer in everything, is that, you just feel sorrow for the families that are going to have to get that phone call and potentially have to go down and identify a loved one. And, you just, your heart goes out to them. And then on the other side of it, being a Second Amendment advocate, you kind of brace for what you know is coming because the template's already set. The media, if you look at my Facebook news feed, like the little time hop thing that pops up, it's like an exact carbon copy of right after Sandy Hook. Like the same stuff is being said by the same people, and even though it's a totally different situation, when you look at all the factors of it, the same knives are out that were after Sandy Hook, and it's a different circumstance altogether. But like I said, first thing is obviously feeling for the families and wanting to give them the time to heal, but that's not going to happen in this 24-hour news cycle, so you just kind of brace for what is coming.
So you teach the combat focus course from Rob Pincus's class, and one of the things that you guys focus on is how to react to a critical situation, an unexpected attack. Like what happened here in this nightclub in Orlando. And it was interesting. I saw this article, Bob Owens had posted on Bearing Arms, where he had sort of broken down frame by frame this video from this police shooting at Love Field earlier this week, where all these people were completely oblivious to what was going on around them. Talk about the mindset that you try to teach your students to prepare them for the worst case scenario that could happen, and how do you prepare yourself for that when most people are creatures of habit, and they go through their lives and they don't think about what could happen and how horrible it could be.
Right. Well, we talk a lot about the body's natural reactions to an unexpected attack. So there's reaction, and then there's recognition. So when something happens to you, regardless of who you are, you're going to have some degree of reaction to it. That's your body's instincts of preparing you for that fight or flight moment when you're either going to make a decision to take action, or you're going to make a decision to run away or hide or whatever you're going to do. And so we integrate those body's natural reactions into the context of defensive shooting when we're getting our gun out of the holster and that sort of thing. And then what we talk about a lot in the program is what we call the power of recognition. And we use the warrior expert theory that says that through frequent and realistic practice and training, a warrior expert can use the power of recognition to respond more efficiently to one of these unexpected attacks. So what you saw kind of in the video, you see some people reacting, and then they really don't know what it is quite that they're seeing or hearing, and they just continue on with the way that they would in any situation nowadays. Everybody's getting out their smartphone wanting to take a picture, or they're continuing on with what's going on because they haven't really recognized what it is that they're standing right next to. Even though to those of us who are part of the gun culture and who have watched dash cam videos and surveillance videos and trained and that sort of thing, we immediately, we hear the gunshots, we're going to have a different recognition of what's going on, and then our response based on that recognition that happens after our body reacts, we recognize what's going on, and then we respond based on our trained, learned responses. It's going to be totally different than those people who are whipping out their cell phone. Like Bob Owens, I haven't read the full article, but I have seen it posted on Facebook, and he's talking about, get out of there. You're not going to be continue unloading your car and bust out your cell phone and try to get closer to it. That's not going to do you any good. So, but that's the difference between having that power of recognition and not is having some kind of a thing that you've thought about beforehand and that you've run through in your head, even in a thought process mode. Maybe you haven't gone to a class, maybe you haven't been to scenario training or anything like that, but if you've at least had the thought process of, okay, these things happen, and when I see something like this happen, what's my plan? And then when you see that thing happening and you recognize it, then you've got something you can go to, and hopefully that thing is not bust out my cell phone and walk over towards it. Either it's go to get involved in it if you feel compelled to do so and you're in a position where you can help somebody, or take cover, get in your car and leave, whatever that appropriate response is. And the key though is thinking about it ahead of time, because in the moment, if you haven't thought about it ahead of time, you're more than likely going to be like one of those people. So that's the unfortunate thing. So,
and that was my next question was, absent taking a class like yours, what can somebody, just the average ordinary Joe, do to sort of prepare themselves to get into that mindset that, to avoid just standing around and doing nothing whenever the feces hits the rotating blades, as they say.
Right. Well, I made a video on Facebook the other day that kind of addressed that, and talking about mindset, you're talking about thinking about things, right? So the first step is just accepting that it could happen, even though it's unlikely, it could happen to you, and then just thinking about the situation, visualizing it in your brain. Just like if you're a pitcher or something like that, you want to become a good baseball pitcher, you're going to visualize throwing that strike. Well, you're visualizing throwing some version of that strike in that context, right? So what would I do if somebody did come into the building that I was in and started shooting? Where are my exits? Have I looked around, and do I know where I could go to get out of this building? We talk about evade, barricade, respond. So whenever I'm in a workplace or a building that I frequent, I'm going to know where the exits are. That's really what situational awareness means. It's not this, I can be in threat level orange or whatever all the time and be aware of everything, but I can know certain things about my environment. And one of the first things is, how could I get out of here if I needed to? So that evasion tactic, getting away from the bad guy. And then we talk about being prepared to barricade, make it harder for the bad guy to get to where you are. If that means going into a bathroom and getting behind a locked door, throwing a chair in front of the door, running up a staircase to put stairs in between you and the bad guy, or finding cover if it's a big open area and there's not any closed off spaces you can get to, finding cover that could potentially protect you from bullets. What does cover mean? Knowing all that sort of thing. And then as a last resort, or if given the opportunity to save lives, respond, be prepared to fight, and resolve ahead of time that you're going to take some kind of action. One of those three things. You're either going to get out of there, you're going to find a place to barricade yourself and all the people that you can to save their lives, and you're also going to be prepared to fight if you're given the opportunity, or if the bad guy forces it on you and you have to. So a lot of those people in Orlando, we know a lot of them got out. This one bouncer that we know about now, who is a former Marine, was able to find a back exit, and he got 20 or 30 people out of the building. So he was taking action. He was busy working. He wasn't just waiting on his chance to get shot or sending text messages or whatever. And then there's some people that barricaded themselves in the bathroom, taking the right step. But really the one that gets missed most of the time is the fight piece of it, the be prepared to respond. So if I can get into a bathroom, I got to have a plan for if the guy comes into the bathroom with me, or if he stops to reload and I'm behind him and I can, tackle him like we saw that guy in the surveillance video in Seattle do.
Right.
Those are all things that you have to resolve ahead of time, that I'm going to do something, to affect this situation. And a lot of people don't think about it at all. And so when they actually get in a situation, they don't recognize it. And then, even the bouncer guy that was sneaking people out the back during the Orlando shooting said most people were just frozen up. They didn't know what to do. And that's, I think, a more exaggerated example of what you saw at the Love Field thing, is people who hadn't thought about that situation before, freezing up and trying to improvise in the moment. And those improvisations usually don't work too well.
That's sort of that, like you were talking about, that body's natural response is just I don't know what to do. I'm not prepared for this. I haven't thought this through, so you just freeze in place. And what you're trying to teach your students, and what you're suggesting, is if you've thought through these scenarios and you've thought about, how do I get out? What do I do if this happens? What's and I think about this myself. Everywhere I go, I sit down and I think about, how can I get out? Where's whenever I pull up to a light, how's the safest way, if I had to, that I could pull away from this intersection? Just those little things like that. It doesn't have to be, I'm constantly looking for trouble. Some people seem to think that if you're a concealed carrier, you're always looking for a fight. And 9 times out of 10, what I'm looking for is a way to get away.
Exactly. Yeah. If I'm at Love Field and the police are engaging a suspect, it's probably going to be, not one of the primary or secondary options for me to go get involved in that. I'm probably getting in the car and leaving. I'm calling the police and saying, hey, there's a shooting here, and, being that extra good witness, or, maybe there's somebody that needs medical attention, something like that. That's probably the things I'm thinking about. And that's the misnomer that a lot of concealed carriers too, I think, carry around with them. Like, you look at the aftermath of this Orlando shooting, and what's the talking point? Well, a good guy with the gun could have stopped that. Well, it doesn't matter if the good guy's got a gun, and it doesn't matter if the bad guy's got a gun. It matters who's got the will to fight, who's got the will to survive. And if you got the will to survive, then that gun, if you happen to have it, is a force multiplier. You got more options there. But just because you may not have your gun, because you can't have it everywhere, that nightclub was obviously an illegal place to carry in Florida, and I don't encourage people to illegal carry. So if you're in that situation, that doesn't mean you're defenseless. You can do something. You can pick up a bar stool. You can, tackle the guy. You can smother him with your T-shirt, whatever you got to do, to make that guy have to think twice about just being able to shoot fish in a barrel. And so it's having that thought process ahead of time, and then if possible, if your funds and your time frame allows it, get to a class and learn how to do those things by walking through it in practical exercises.
Right. And like you said, you can't carry everywhere. I don't remember who it was. Somebody who said, you can't carry a gun everywhere, but that doesn't mean you can't carry something else.
Exactly.
You can always carry a flashlight. You could always carry, a tactical pen. You could carry mace or pepper spray, something. Just carry something.
Exactly. And the tool fixation in this whole debate goes both ways, and it frustrates me equally on both sides. On the gun control side, they're fixated on the tool and wanting to ban it, right?
Mm-hmm.
On our side, we're fixating on the tool and saying it's the only solution to the problem. Well, it's a solution to a very small subset of problems that might require the use of deadly force, which a mass shooting obviously being one of them. But even in that situation, you have to accept that there's some people who a gun may not be part of their frame of reference, but if we teach them to fight back, then a lot of them, I think, are going to come to the logical conclusion that, hey, I can fight back more efficiently if I have this firearm, and then we've got another person won over for the Second Amendment. And I think that crosses over the partisan divide a lot better than focusing on the gun and focusing, on the tool like the other side likes to do. Well, let's talk about personal defense. Let's talk about fighting back, and then let's talk about, okay, well, now that we understand that we can fight back and we have permission to and we're allowed to do that, here's an efficient tool for you to be able to do that in this circumstance. And I think that wins a lot more people over than just, shouting them down about your AR-15 or whatever.
Right.
So.
Well said. All right. Aaron Israel from Fundamental Defense, thanks for joining us today, and I appreciate your input, and we'll see you in the roundtable.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you.
So you have your concealed carry permit or license to carry. Now what? Now you need a good holster. Not one of those cheap neoprene prophylactic holsters you can buy in the big box stores. You need a holster custom built for the firearm you intend to carry every day. Check out cooksholsters.com. Made in the USA, Cooks holsters are available in a wide range of colors and designs for inside the waistband or outside waistband carry. They carry a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and take 15% off everything in the store. You put in the time and effort to legally carry a firearm for personal protection. Protect your firearm with a custom holster from cooksholsters.com.
This is Pastor Brian Wolfmueller of Table Talk Radio. Thank goodness you're listening to the Armed Lutheran Radio podcast.
Welcome back to this special episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. We're dedicating this entire show to this terrible attack on the nightclub in Orlando last Sunday morning. Joining me for this segment is our co-host for Clinging to God and Guns, Pastor John Bennett of St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Pastor Bennett actually approached me with the idea of doing something a little bit different this week, so I got to give you credit for where this whole show has gone this week, and I appreciate your input, and I appreciate you joining us for today's show.
Thank you, Lloyd. It's good to be with you. I'm looking forward to discussing this.
Well, in the aftermath of Orlando, we've seen, all these different reactions. With the reaction from the political left has been to politicize it, obviously. There's been some religious voices, both so-called Christians, I think of course, the Westboro Baptists and a group out in California, and then, of course, the Islamic voices who have been quite ugly. There have been efforts from the media to blame Christians for this attack. What should our reaction be as Christians, as Lutherans? How are we to view what and think about what happened at that nightclub on Sunday morning?
Well, my first reaction is I was absolutely heartbroken. I'd just gotten home from church, and my wife had read this on Facebook, and it broke my heart. And part of this too is that I have an uncle who is gay, and so these issues I probably look at them a little more objectively than others might do so. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, Christians are to be pro-life people, and that means life matters regardless of the circumstances.
Right.
And in this case, we look at this as a tragic loss of life. There's another aspect to it, too, that as a people who believe in the Bible as the inspired and inerrant Word of God, as most conservative Lutherans do, the Bible makes it very clear that those who live in unrepentant sin and die without faith in Christ are lost. By and large, the majority of the gay community is not Christian,
Right.
because the Bible has very clear passages where it condemns same-sex relationships. So not only do we mourn the loss of life, but we mourn the eternal loss for those who died apart from Christ. So as the Christian response, whenever there is a tragedy like this, should always be one of love, compassion, and grief. I would hope that most loving pro-life Christians, for example, if the attack had been on a mosque, that within the United States, that it would still be viewed as this great tragedy where there is this great loss of life.
Absolutely.
Life is important because God is the author of life. And so, as Christians, always, it should be one of love and compassion, regardless of the circumstances.
I mentioned earlier the odd efforts to sort of place blame for this terrible attack on everyone, seemingly, except for the person responsible, the person who was actually holding the gun. It was interesting that yesterday I saw this video from Dennis Prager, his Prager University series. It was contrasting the view from liberals and conservatives whenever there's an act of violent crime. And it boiled down to, and Prager didn't directly or correctly identify it, but he basically said that the difference is that liberals excuse these acts of evil, these acts of violence, because the person themselves can't be responsible. They have to have been caused by something else, something external, because they believe deep down that human nature is good. But we as Lutherans recognize otherwise.
Absolutely. It's ironic, though, that whenever there's some radical mental case decides to shoot up an abortion clinic, that the left becomes unhinged talking about the evils of Christianity.
Right.
But we have to look at this objectively. That even if the liberal ideology that evil is something that's taught, it has to originate from somewhere. And so it ends up being an exercise in circular arguing. They can never get to the core of it because they always have to assume that it's influenced by some other entity.
Right.
The truth, though, is that we live in a fallen and sinful world where evil isn't some abstract concept applied to imaginary boogeyman, but it's a very real entity that manifests itself as we see these tragic events like what took place in Orlando. And this is what the scriptures teach, too. The scriptures make it very clear that man is by nature sinful and unclean. There's multiple Bible passages that we could look at, but three in particular that I wanted to bring up. The first is from Ecclesiastes 7, verse 20, which reads, "Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins." Now, taking the Bible as being the inspired and inerrant Word of God, that tells us that there is no one on earth who is capable of not sinning. So how then is evil always going to be from some sort of external influence? The other passage that I think speaks even more clearly to this is what is written in Genesis 8, verse 21. And this is God speaking to Noah following the flood. And God says to Noah, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth." So God himself says that the intent of man's heart is evil. It's not one that is inclined towards goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Psalm 51, verse 5, David also points out that sin is original, inherent, and inborn in man. He says, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." To those who might say, wait a second, does that mean that he was conceived because he was illegitimate? If you take a look at Scripture and of David's family, that certainly was not the case. So what do we conclude then? That he's not talking about some sort of arbitrary relationship with his parents, but he's speaking of the inherent sinful nature that is in all of us.
Obviously, the obvious point that we've got to get around to is the fact that this was an attack on a gay nightclub. We all know how Islam views homosexuality. There are currently something like, 10 or 12 countries in the world where homosexuality is punishable by death. In Syria, they're throwing gays off of buildings. In Iran, they're hanging them in the public square. Gay rights advocates and activists are often keen to criticize Christians for our views on homosexuality and issues like transgender bathrooms or gay marriage. So what does the Bible say? Let's get down to that. What does the Bible say about homosexuality?
Well, if we take a look in the Old Testament, it would appear on the surface that Christians are no different than Muslims in this regard. But I also want to point out that when you take a look at the context between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the contrast there is that the Old Testament, by and large, is a theocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And when we get to the New Testament, these kind of instructions are no longer mentioned at all.
Right.
No longer are we told to execute people for these purposes. In fact, you have the clear example where Jesus is called upon by the Pharisees who had this woman who was caught in adultery. But what does Jesus do? He forgives the woman.
Right.
Whereas Old Testament Jewish law would have required her to be stoned to death. In Exodus 20, verse 13, it says, Leviticus 20, verse 13, if a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. I would also add that, by and large, for the majority of sexual sins that are mentioned in the Old Testament, specifically the book of Leviticus, the requirement is almost always death. But again, it's all about the context here.
Exactly.
We are no longer living in Old Testament Israel under this theocracy. We are living as the followers of Jesus Christ.
Right.
Now, it doesn't mean that suddenly these issues of sexuality are somehow null and void, that those laws don't apply anymore, because throughout the New Testament there are numerous passages. If you were to take a look at all of Paul's pastoral epistles, the issue of sexual sin takes up a large chunk of his writings. So we don't suddenly just discount them for some reason because we're no longer living in the Old Testament times.
So what should our attitude as Christians be towards the gay community, towards transgendered people?
Well, again, as I had mentioned earlier, we are to have an attitude of love and compassion in circumstances like this, but that love and compassion isn't to exist apart from these tragic circumstances, that we are to be loving and compassionate regardless. I think one of the issues that we run into is that somehow in our society the concept of love and acceptance have been assumed to be synonyms, that you can love without accepting what somebody does.
Exactly.
So, and as a perfect example of this, if love and acceptance were the same thing, by saying that Jesus loves us, does that mean that he suddenly puts a stamp of approval on every single thing that we do? If that were the case, he would need not die on the cross to save us.
That's exactly right. So this Old Testament viewpoint of homosexuality, it seems pervasive in there are certain sects who still think of homosexuality that way, and the left seems to paint all of Christianity with that Old Testament view towards homosexuality, and that's how we end up with this double standard that where whenever a Muslim goes out and shoots up a gay nightclub, suddenly he's not responsible, Christians are. How does that work?
It's completely mind-boggling, isn't it? That it's the way the media wants to paint this. You would think that the shooter was a pasty white Christian male. I'm sure the media would have loved it if that were the case. But just some of the things that have been said, attacking Christians over the last few days, it's so disappointing. After 9/11, it seems that tragedy brought out the best in a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there's always exceptions like Westboro Baptist Church, which we can get to in a bit. But when it comes to this issue, it's really sad because it seems to have brought out the worst in some very outspoken people. For example, Jim Oberfeld, who was a lead plaintiff in last year's U.S. Supreme Court fight for same-sex marriage, this is what he said in response to this. He said, every single politician, every single religious leader, everyone who has espoused us less than human and less deserving of equal rights, they are responsible for this. So now because you are a Christian and on the virtue of your Christian beliefs, or even if you're not a Christian and on the basis of the 10th Amendment, you felt that should have been a states' rights issue, if you opposed this Supreme Court ruling, that suddenly you are now responsible for what took place. It's just truly sad that people are saying these sort of things as if a Christian was the one who pulled the trigger. There was an ACLU lawyer, and his tweets were rather vicious. He said the Christian right has introduced 200 anti-LGBT bills in the last 6 months, and people are blaming Islam for this. No.
And we all know, or if we don't know, we ought to know by now, that it's Islam that calls for death to homosexuals.
Just to give you a quote from the Hadith, and the Hadith, as opposed to the Quran, the Hadith is the teachings of Muhammad, and the different sects in Islam regard the Hadith in different ways. For example, ISIS takes the Hadith very literally. The Muslims running the nation of Iran, they take these passages very literally. And there are multiple passages like this. I'll just read the one. It says, the messenger of Allah said, whoever you find doing the action of the people of Lot, execute the one who does it and the one to whom it is done. And on the surface, we also see that Muhammad wasn't near as learned as many Muslims would like to paint him, because he made this correlation between Lot, who had lived in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah and fled before God destroyed those cities, as the people of Lot refer to those who practice homosexuality.
Right.
So that's what it says in the Hadith, and there's multiple passages that say this.
Right.
That those who, in essence, practice homosexuality, that they are to be put to death.
So while the Hadith is calling for the execution of homosexuals and Christians are talking about loving your neighbor, we're the bad guys somehow.
Somehow we are, but the reason we are is because it fits their political talking points. But, and I had alluded to Westboro Baptist Church, so had you. It seems as if, the hypocrisy is that the left doesn't want this shooter to represent all of Islam, but they want the Westboro Baptist Church to represent all of Christianity.
Right.
And as far as the Westboro Baptist Church goes, in essence, they are a cult. They don't believe in proclaiming the love of Christ, proclaiming the gospel. If you look on their website, When they talk about proclaiming the gospel of love, it's when they are going to these various places and picketing against, whether it's against those who have died in service to our nation, whether it's places like Orlando, which they plan to picket and protest at.
Mm-hmm.
On their website, they or this was either from their Twitter account. Yeah, from their Twitter account. They said God sent the shooter to the Orlando Fag Club. That was their response when CNN had tweeted that this was the one of the worst. Well, they call it the worst mass shooting in U.S. history.
Yeah.
The response from the congregation's Twitter feed was, adds a whole new meaning to the fag chant, "We're number one, we're number one." So I want to roundly condemn the response that has come from this organization, and I'm sure that there are some others like it out there, that what they have done in essence is they have put a great hindrance to the proclamation of the gospel. They have put a great hindrance to the work of mercy by Christians towards victims in these horrific circumstances. They are doing more to hurt the gospel than the shooter himself has done.
Okay, so we've talked about this sort of Old Testament view of homosexuality, the one that the Westboro Baptist Bunch seems to think is the only way of viewing homosexual issues. What is the New Testament view, and how does that affect our view of our neighbors who might happen to be homosexual or transgendered?
Well, it's a very good question. The one thing that we have to be faithful on is that in the New Testament, it is still called sin.
Right.
Paul makes this very clear in Romans chapter 1, where he says, "Therefore God gave them up to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for the women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliceness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Paul groups all of the sin of homosexuality into all of these other sins as indicative of those who are not of God, the unbelievers of the world, those who have given themselves over to the sins of the flesh. And then he adds, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So Paul even goes so far to say that, and here he's, I'm assuming, alluding to the Old Testament laws regarding sexual sin as well as other sins, that death should be the consequence for these things. Paul doesn't deny that, but also he doesn't command it either. He says under God they stand condemned. He doesn't come out and say that they ought to be killed. But when it comes to how we are to treat our neighbor then, and by neighbor I mean anyone who is known among us that is gay, lesbian, etc. Here's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, starting with verse 9. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? It is not those inside the church whom you are to judge, God judges those outside. But purge the evil person from among you. What Paul is saying here, these are instructions to the church that if you have somebody who is engaged in sexual sin, such as homosexuality, if they are within the congregation, then there are certain ways to deal with them. But if they are not within the congregation, then you have no business judging them. He says that that is for God to do. So this means then that we are free to act in a way of love and compassion to them. At the same time, I would say love and compassion includes, if the opportunity arises, to speak the truth, that God's will for our lives is not to live in such a way. But ultimately, what it comes down to, the way that we ought to treat those within the LGBT community is really all about loving our neighbor as we are instructed to by Christ. And this concept of loving our neighbor, we're given the example of who our neighbor is in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It includes all people. It even includes those people we don't necessarily like or wouldn't necessarily associate with on a daily basis. So, but we have this very firm instruction by Christ to love our neighbor. He even calls upon us to love our enemies and to do good to those who persecute you. But Paul also says a little bit about this in Romans chapter 13. Paul writes, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other command there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. Now, Christ instructs us to love even our enemies. Mm-hmm. I would not say that those within the LGBT community are necessarily our enemies. A person could make the argument that certainly there's that militant faction within the LGBT community that would easily consider us to be their enemies, but that isn't to be the perspective of the Christian. And even if they were to treat us as enemies, this no way negates our obligation to show them love.
Amen. And thank you for that. It's exactly what I was looking for here. I'm so glad that you came up and suggested this idea for this segment, and that we decided to rearrange this segment in this show in this way. It's a perspective that, unfortunately, because of the way the media and the left has been behaving over the last few days, it's a perspective that unfortunately a lot of people aren't hearing.
Right. And what's sad is that where you can have a generous outpouring of love and compassion from the Christian community, instead, you have many within the liberal media painting Christians with this broad brush of hatred.
Right. Pastor Bennett, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Stay tuned to Armed Lutheran Radio. We've got more coming up with Aaron Israel and Bill Silvia after this.
Hi. This is Reverend Ken Blanchard, also known as the Black Man with a Gun, and you're listening to my friend and brother from another mother, the Armed Lutheran.
All right, welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. We're joined now by the full stable of Armed Lutheran contributors: Aaron Israel from Fundamental Defense, Sergeant Bill Silvia, and Pastor John Bennett of St. John Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Thank you all for being here. By now, we've all seen the various responses to the shooting in Orlando. Anybody surprised by what you've seen this week?
Wow. As far as like media coverage?
Any of it, the media, the president, the Congress, it's all been just an absolute crap storm.
Yeah, it's pretty much just look back to 2012 and hit repeat, and we're watching it all again. So
it really is.
That's pretty much what I was going to say. I'm not really surprised by any of it, except for the lack of information of what actually happened.
Right.
But that's kind of normal. But even when the information comes out, you're finding out more things on social media about what actually happened than you do in the media, it seems like, compared to when we used to. You'd have, CNN or Fox News or whatever would come out a couple days later and start saying, well, now we've learned this, now we've learned that. Seems like we've learned everything on social media way ahead of them.
Right.
I was a little disappointed by some of the responses. I think the worst response was there was a Baptist pastor in California. The morning that after it happened, that in his sermon he was lamenting that the shooter didn't finish the job and expressed a desire for the government to round up every gay person and execute them. So
awful.
Ridiculous.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. That's all I can say.
I really thought this was going to be kind of a wake-up call. Typically you see after these big attacks, the country, even if it's for a short time, the country comes together. And here was an attack on one of the Democrat Party's prized constituencies, the gay community. And instead, what we've seen is this really amazingly fast, knee-jerk reaction to avoid calling it what it is, and the immediate call for even more gun control.
Yeah, and I think obviously those knee-jerk reactions have come to fruition just like we would expect. But then also I've seen some on Facebook especially, and I don't know who's putting these up, but apparently in West Hollywood there's a lot of the like a take on the gay pride flag, except it's got the "Don't Tread on Me" serpent on there, and then it says #shootback.
Right.
Those are apparently popping up in West Hollywood, which is kind of like the capital of the homosexual community in America. So I don't know who's putting them up, but hopefully somebody's waking up. And I know I got added to one of the instructors I know from actually think he's on one of the other podcasts. I met him at NRA, but he's put together a list of gun instructors who are willing to, not that anybody would be unwilling. I don't know why you would turn anybody away, but are willing to, have people that community come into a class and, handle a firearm for the first time and learn the basics and that sort of thing. And he's put together a pretty substantial list of, business owners and professionals who are open their doors to the LGBT community in that fashion. So there's some good that's come out of it, but yeah, the knee-jerk reactions are definitely there too. So.
Yep. And then we got the Democrats with this 15-hour filibuster to force a vote on the same old, a couple of ideas that neither of which are going to stop. They wouldn't have stopped the shooting in Orlando. They wouldn't have stopped the shooting in San Bernardino. We're talking about background checks and ban to prevent those on the no-fly list from buying guns. Again, this guy wasn't on the no-fly list, so it's basically an attack on due process. Where do you think this is all going to end up? It looks like the Republicans are just are caving on this and are going to allow a vote on both.
The Republicans seem to be really good about doing that lately, don't they?
They really do.
It seems like it's been 7 years of bend over and give the president everything he wants from the Republicans in both houses of Congress, with the exception of just a handful. And it's really disappointing. They're giving him everything that he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it being an election year, all those guys, it kind of, and 2012 when all the Sandy Hook stuff happened was right after an election. But I mean, even there, I mean, they're looking at their constituencies and they want to be able to say that they fought on that left-wing issue of gun control when they were given the opportunity. But I don't have a, obviously anything could happen, but I don't think there's going to be anything major that comes of this as far as legislation, because I think even if they have the votes, that there's Democrats that, come from more conservative states in the South and Southwest that still want to keep their A rating with the NRA. So they may go to a vote, but I don't think it's going to make it out of the House, and especially not out of the Senate, even if it does go for a vote. But that's just kind of my read on it. I could be wrong about that, but who knows?
I agree with Aaron on that, but the funny thing is, from a law enforcement perspective, the laws that are on the books, if they would just let law enforcement enforce it. I mean, when a gun dealer, the week before this guy goes and buys all this ammo and weapons and stuff, has a bad feeling about him because he comes into a shop and is asking questions and wants to buy this, wants to buy that, and he denies him and chews him out, and then calls the FBI and turns this guy in, and they do nothing, and then this happens. There's a lot of people don't realize that the Obama administration is really, reined in law enforcement from the lowest level to the highest level in this country, and he doesn't let them do what they need to do. And if they can just be allowed to do their jobs, I mean, if the FBI had gotten that tip on him and followed it up and said, hey, he's on the watch list, we really need to investigate this, we need to go check this guy out, maybe we could have prevented this.
Right.
Yeah, I saw one of his coworkers getting interviewed saying basically everything short of I was shouting from the rooftops, there's something wrong with this guy, and people in the company are ignoring him, and then when it went to law enforcement, he didn't get really much of a call back, and that's just his testimony. But yeah, that's definitely, they say see something, say something, but apparently that's followed up with do nothing under this administration. So,
well, because under this administration, you can't point out anyone for any type of ethnicity or religious belief or anything like that, then you get the finger pointed back at you, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, if we have a terrorism issue, it's Islamic terrorism. You don't have to put two and two together to figure that out.
Right.
There's, if you have somebody who's on the watch list, then you have, a gun dealer calling you saying, hey, I got this guy coming to my store. He's saying a lot of weird things, asking to buy a lot of ammunition and weapons, and I got a really funny feeling about him. It's time to check that guy out. Don't wait, because when you wait, people get killed.
Yep.
Well, and the guy was apparently asking about body armor, and thank goodness the guy did have a bad feeling about it and wouldn't sell it to him, or they don't sell body armor, and he found that unusual that the guy was insistent that they sell him some body armor. And then went off and started talking on his phone in a foreign language, and the guy felt really strange and tried to report it, and it went nowhere. The administration apparently has gone out of its way. We keep hearing these stories, especially this week, about how they're hamstringing federal agencies. They've gone out of their way to shut down investigations into Muslim communities. They're more concerned with investigating hate speech against Muslims than investigating Muslims who might want to kill Americans. Why do you think that we have this inability to confront what we're really up against?
There's a term that I don't know if I can't take credit for it, but I call it Islamophobia, fear of being labeled Islamophobic. And it seems that's what's driving a lot of this is that we've got this high protected political class of Muslims. Just a hypothetical question: what would have been the response by the FBI if he was a pasty-faced Christian male of European descent?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember a pasty-faced male in Charleston, and suddenly he was representative of every Christian, every Southerner, every white person in the entire country.
Yeah, but the funny thing is this is completely and obviously Islamic terrorism, and the president comes on and says, we don't know his intentions, which in retrospect is a bold-faced lie because he was posting on Facebook allegiance to ISIS and this and that. And I'm sure he knew about it, having been a former military intelligence officer. That's one of the first things you look at, social media. And there's just this climate of political correctness where, you can't say anything about anybody and then it turns into, well, you're not right, there's something wrong with you. And that's, especially in law enforcement, that's ridiculous. I mean, there's a time and a place to say, hey, look, you can't say derogatory things about somebody or something like that. But when you're, isolating political correctness so much that you're basically make an entire career field ineffective, that's just insanity. I mean, and he's done that with the military as well. So,
right.
Yep.
There was another story too that really, in many ways, I look at this as a failure by the FBI to really investigate the way they should have. Back in April, the shooter and his wife were visiting Disney World, and their behavior was suspicious enough that security reported them to the FBI for their suspicious behavior. So why wasn't that followed up upon either?
Yeah, it just goes back to that political correct mentality.
Right. Well, let me get your thoughts on this. We kind of skirted around it just a moment ago. This sort of double standard that is always applied. We were talking a minute ago about the guy in Charleston. The gunman in this case was a Muslim. He was pledged his allegiance to ISIS, but according to the media and according to our president, he doesn't represent all Muslims. But he does apparently represent all gun owners. He represents all Republicans. He represents the NRA. The shooter in Charleston, like I mentioned a minute ago, he represented all whites, all Southerners, all gun owners. It's obviously so ridiculous a claim, so illogical that we used to be able to laugh this stuff off, but we can't anymore. I mean, do you really think do you think the American public buys this stuff? Or I don't know. I wonder now if the public is dumbed down enough that they actually believe the kind of stuff that our media and our politicians are peddling.
I'm not so sure that a good amount of them do. I mean, you've got rigid ideologues on both sides. It's kind of like talked about in the one-on-one segment yesterday with, kind of the intro thing is you got on that side of the fence, on the gun control side, they're automatically going to go for banning guns, and they're very myopic in that area. They're going to let's get rid of the guns. And then on the far right side, it goes automatically to, well, let's ban immigration of this group or that group, whether that might be justified for a short time or not, but they focus on that, and then they say, hey, the only thing that solves this problem is to shoot back. Well, somewhere in the middle is everybody else who's concerned about, I want to get home at the end of the day and I want to not be a victim in this situation. And regardless of whether they go to the extent that we would hope they would and, look into firearms training and that sort of thing, since that's the most efficient way to deal with that, if we can empower them to have the permission and have the mindset to, I'm going to do something in this situation, regardless of whether it's a Muslim shooting it up or a pasty-faced white guy in Charleston, I'm going to fight back against that guy. And I think that's something that, regardless of where you may be on any other political issue, you have that self-preservation, that desire to get home at the end of the day. And if we can take these teachable moments and say, hey, I don't care who the bad guy is, let's fight back against this guy. Next time he comes in there, how about 10 or 15 people, or, if we get the message out enough, half the club gets after him, and then he gets 3 people instead of 40, And if we can get that message out there, I think that's the teachable moment out of all of this, when you kind of cut through all the political stuff that is going to happen on both sides. And that stuff needs to be talked about, but, as people in the firearms community, we're going to win more converts to our way of thinking if we talk about it in the context of personal defense than if we, just completely lose that in the political rhetoric on either side, I think.
All right, so let's look at some of these crazy proposals that have been thrown out by the left. I want to get your opinions from your different points of view. Aside from the obvious constitutional issues, would any of these ideas actually make a difference? I'm just going to throw these out and let you guys hammer away at them. Universal background checks.
Yeah, he passed that, didn't he?
Several times, I think. What they keep bringing this up as though this is the closing the internet loophole, as though you can buy a gun on the internet without a background check.
It's just plain and simple ignorance. It's kind of like the gun show loophole. There's no loophole. You buy from a dealer, you get background check, you get a NICS check done. Mm-hmm. Same thing on the internet. You have it transferred to a firearms dealer, and you get your NICS checks done. It's ignorance, basically. That's all it is.
To me, I see it as a complete deception, because what the left does is they create this boogeyman that furthers their narrative, assuming the ignorance of the population.
Most of their constituency doesn't know a whole lot about guns or about how guns are purchased or transferred, and so they hear this, oh, you can buy a gun over the internet without a background check. Oh gosh, that's horrible.
Yeah, and they play on that fear. They play on that fear with, information that's not correct. How many times have you seen on the news where they're talking about assault weapons and fully automatic assault weapons and just stuff that, if you have basic knowledge of, most firearms out there, you cringe and you just like, what the heck is wrong with them? Perfect example today, my brother, who's not really a firearms enthusiast or anything like that, he came by to visit while he was out doing some sales calls, and he asked me a question point blank. He was like, hey, so the shooter deal in Orlando, he had a fully automatic AR-15. Is it really fully automatic? And I'm like, no, let me explain it to you. So, and it's funny because he was like, that's what I thought, but they kept saying that. So, and there's a huge segment of society that they don't know anything about that. They don't, they know what they see on TV and in movies. And unfortunately, your AR-15 and my AR-15 looks just like the AR-15 or the M16 that Arnold Schwarzenegger's, got a, bottomless magazine. He's shooting 1,000 rounds through this thing in 10 seconds. So it comes down to ignorance again. They don't know, they don't want to know. They're just going with the little bit of information that's given to them, and they run with it.
Yeah, and then even when they go to quote unquote seek out the information, like there's the big story going viral on Facebook is the guy who supposedly with the intention of seeing what it was like, I'm going to go and rent an AR at the local indoor gun range and I'm going to shoot it. And this guy's talking about I had PTSD and all that. Well, I mean, I've seen 7-year-olds, shooting ARs and 3-gun, and they don't seem to have an issue with it. But it's because of these preconceived notions that Bill was talking about. You go out there and you already have your mind made up. Well, you're not looking for education. You're just looking to further a narrative. So,
right. Preventing those on the terrorist watch list from buying guns. This is that closing the so-called terrorist loophole.
Yeah.
Funny thing from a law enforcement perspective, I have friends or acquaintances that have called me and said, hey, I was at a gun show, a gun store, whatever. I was trying to buy a gun, and for whatever reason, it got denied. So I tell them you need to call the number they give you for the FBI, for NICS and ATF and all that stuff. And they call, and a couple days later or later that day, this happened 2 or 3 times to me, they'll call me back, and they're like, well, they said that it was a sound-alike of somebody who's committed a crime, and they're going to have to look into it further and to give them 2 weeks. I understand that, but it's funny that somebody whose name sounds similar to somebody who committed a crime, a felony crime, is being denied getting a gun, but a guy who's on a terrorist watch list is not. And then people are trying to say they're not allowed to do that. What? Well, if your name's John Smith and you go to buy a gun, I'm sure there's been a John Smith that has committed some felony crimes, murder, whatever, and it's probably just as difficult for them, but.
And I had a friend back in North Carolina had that happen too, and he had had the exact same name and middle initial as a guy who had unpaid parking tickets, and they wouldn't. And because in North Carolina it's a May issue state, and you have to get this pistol purchase permit. He could never get. He had a hard time getting his purchase permit approved because he had the same name and middle initial as this other guy in another county.
Wow. I'm doubly in awe of that one. A pistol purchase permit and then the whole story. It's like I don't know which that bothers me worse.
That's an old Jim Crow thing that grassroots North Carolina has been fighting to try and get repealed, and the sheriffs invariably will at the last minute will fight to keep in place.
Well, even here in
Texas, Minnesota too.
They were doing that here in Texas with concealed carry. If you were in a Democratic county and the highest legal authority, law enforcement authority, didn't want to sign off on that or any Form 3s or NFA items or anything like that, you were kind of screwed unless you did a trust or whatever. It was, it's ridiculous.
All right. Banning high-capacity magazines.
I think they're called high capacity.
Oh, sorry.
High capacity assault.
Standard capacity magazine, sorry.
Oh, standard capacity. Okay, I was curious what a high capacity magazine was.
He was talking about the high capacity assault clips. Those things.
I don't have any of those. All of my magazines are probably less than standard capacity. I mean, if you're in a gunfight and you've got 30 rounds and you need all 30 rounds, you're probably going to be wishing you had 40 rounds or 50 rounds. So, yeah. I know a lot of cops that, you get issued your gun, 2 extra magazines, and there's a whole lot of people that I work with that are carrying around a lot more than 2 magazines.
Yeah, and the funny thing from a training perspective on that, when they throw that canard out there about the high cap magazines, is they always talk about, well, they're going to have to reload more. Well, what does it matter if you're not teaching people to fight back in the first place? Because they're going to be the first ones, the people on the left, to say, you huddle in a corner and wait for your chance to die. That's where that whole mentality comes from, the things they're still teaching in schools and that sort of deal. So if we're really concerned about, how long it takes to reload, why are we not teaching people to fight back? Because that's the only time that even comes into the conversation. So it's all disingenuous, and it's just another thing on the ban agenda. So
Well,
it's ignorance as well. It's ignorance as well, because if I have to do a magazine reload, I can do a slide lock reload between 1 and 2 seconds. And if you think when you're going to wait till I run out of ammo to come rush me.
And doesn't Virginia Tech just put the lie to that claim anyway? I mean, the guy went in with a Ruger 1022 and a bunch of like a bag full of 10-round magazines.
Yep.
On the magazine capacity limitation, those laws are still on the books in California, and that didn't prevent anything in San Bernardino.
Nope.
Exactly right.
Yep.
How about this is the big one, the one that of course our friend Di-Fi is a favorite of hers, banning quote unquote assault weapons.
Yeah, I don't even know what the definition of that is today. I mean, it's something every day. It's, one day it's ARs, the next day it's shotguns and everything else. They're going to change if they are allowed to ban anything. They're going to add to that list what consists of an assault weapon. So they can't even agree on defining the terms. And if they would at least, the good thing you're seeing at least on some of these left-leaning sides is at least some of them are coming out and straight up calling a spade and saying we want to ban guns. Period. And it's easier to have an argument with somebody if they're going to put their cards on the table than what Feinstein does and some of the other ones of, well, let's talk about this one specific group of weapons. We don't know what those are, but they are more killy than the other weapons, and we want to get rid of those. And
I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's just plain ignorance. I mean, what is an assault weapon? An assault weapon is an STG-44 from World War II. That's the only gun that has actually been called an assault weapon. But, they keep coming up with these different terms for it. Well, this makes it this. Well, this makes it. It's black. It's scary. It's got a bayonet lug. It's just ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, if you go back 200 years, a Kentucky rifle is an assault weapon in their view. I mean, it's
one of the best videos I saw the last time this whole debate was happening, and this is, like I said, just a repeat of 2012, is when they had the big hearings in the Senate, and Ted Cruz goes up there with a picture of, just a bolt action, or just a regular semi-automatic rifle, hunting style, and then he's like, okay, so this is good, and then he holds up a handguard, and he's like, but this is bad. It's like nothing changes, The functionality is still the same. It's just not all killy like a black one,
I remember seeing a guy who took an AR-15, and he painted it all up, the stocks and the buttstock and the forend, so that it was kind of wood grain looking, and now it was a hunting rifle, right? Because it was made of wood. I thought that was pretty funny. But that's really what it boils down to. It's an irrational fear of an inanimate object.
Right.
They're afraid of an AR-15 or an AK-47, style gun because they look scary. They look like something the military has. Okay. So what? They're not the same. I mean,
you
have to pull the trigger every time to get it to shoot. It's not a fully automatic. It's not what they keep trying to tell us it is. It's just ignorance. And the funny thing is, if you ever watched any videos on YouTube where somebody, one of the gun channels takes somebody who's a diehard Democrat liberal and actually talks them into going to the range and shooting different guns, they can lie and they can say whatever they want. You can see the reaction on their face. They're like, oh, this isn't that bad. This is actually kind of fun.
Right.
Yeah, I did a deal with a reality show for one of this comedian named Gabriel Iglesias about a year ago, and
Fluffy.
Fluffy, and his production team came out there, and of course we're talking about people that grew up in California, probably never touched a gun before. One of the producers was from Manhattan, and she'd never shot a gun before. So I've got their production crew out there doing the pre-film stuff, and she sees the AR, and we got one that's suppressed and everything, and she's like, I want to shoot that, and she shoots it, and she's like, what is the big deal with this? I'm like, I don't know, you tell me. I mean, it's fun, right? She's like, yeah, this is cool. Take a picture of me doing this, So when you actually get them out there and introduce somebody who's actually got an open mind, is not trying to further an agenda, then they may disagree with you on everything else politically, but they'll see that, hey, this is not that big of a deal. So that's why I think more of us should try to get our liberal friends to the range, assuming we have any, which would also be a good thing to do. So
right. You mentioned putting all the cards on the table. There have been a couple of publications, the New York Times and I think Rolling Stone actually laid it all out and said it's time to repeal the Second Amendment, ban all civilian gun ownership, and just confiscate them, and that would take care of the problem. But setting aside what I think would be the horrible repercussions of that in terms of I don't think the civilian public would put up with it, and I don't think that it would actually happen. But let's just say in fantasy world that actually happened and there were no civilian-owned guns. Would that actually stop anything?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. And I'll tell you, from a law enforcement perspective, 15 years on a big city streets, I'll tell you right now, I can't even think of a time off the top of my head where I arrested somebody for some sort of crime, whether they had a gun on them or they used a gun that was actually theirs. 99.9% of the time, they are stolen. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, that's all they're going to do. They're going to steal them. So if you try to get rid of them all, they're just going to find them. They're going to either make them or they're going to find them. They're going to go break into that National Guard armory, which historically has happened, and take those guns, or they'll make them, and that's it. You can't get rid of it. It's if you have a club and I have a club, you're better with that club. Well, I'm going to try to find a pointy stick, because my pointy stick's going to hurt you more. There's always going to be that, one-upsmanship, somebody trying to, get a better weapon that's going to protect themselves or hurt the other guy worse than the other. And you can't just take it away and think that that's going to make it work. Look at China. They had another one this last week. They don't have guns. All the guns have been confiscated. There's no gun ownership outside of the government and military and police. And they have people running around stabbing 30 and 40 people.
Yeah, there was a story someone had just posted. It actually was an old story from 2014 in China, where 29 were stabbed to death and another 130 people injured with a knife.
Right.
So if you have a person intent on committing mass murder, if they don't have access to a gun, they're going to find other means of committing their atrocities.
Yeah, and they always hold up the UK as the example of where they want to go on the left. And literally 2 days ago, a British Parliament member was shot outside of her house. And that's gun-free utopia. And still, the bad guys were able to get their hands on it through whatever channels they could find to be able to do that. So it's never going to go away. It's just going to disarm the law-abiding and give us less of a chance to survive. So.
Well, and then you're going to have them going like they did in France. They had a terrorist that went to a police captain's house, waited for the police captain to come out, killed him on his front doorstep, and then went inside, took his guns, and was killing his family. I mean, somebody's got to have the guns to maintain order. They're always going to be there. You can't just get rid of them. This is not some fantasy land. There's always it's just you can't. It's just kind of silly.
So what do we do? What are some solutions, some actual common sense solutions that would work?
Teach people to fight back. Yeah, educate them. I mean, it starts in our schools. I mean, we have already a move away from the paradigm of huddled into a group and, turn the lights off and all that old stuff they used to teach for active shooter response. And we're moving more towards the evade, barricade, respond, or the run, hide, fight. And with fight being more emphasized, and hey, you do have options. Not everybody has to die, even if there's a guy with a gun and you don't have a gun. And teaching people to fight back from that early age, that they do have the permission, they do have the ability, and then, continuing to win battles legislatively and get rid of more and more gun-free zones, which we've been moving in that direction for the past 25 years, and I don't see the momentum slowing down anytime soon, regardless of what they want to focus on in the media. But yeah, just teaching people that there is a solution to this, and it's individual responsibility and your mindset and your willingness to take action. And if these active shooters are coming in and getting their butts kicked when they come in the door and not being able to rack up these massive body counts, then that changes the paradigm a little bit. So we got to educate people to fight back up to and including shooting back when they have the ability to do so.
Yep.
And along with that, it's twofold. It's education. It's demystifying a gun. The people that are afraid of guns, they have that irrational fear. You got to try to coax them into, well, look, let me show you how this works and show you what it does. And, you don't have to make them, NRA members or anything, but get rid of that fear, help them dispel that fear. And then the second thing is it's kind of like our country's kind of lost their way. I remember reading during World War II that this big admiral in Japan did not want to invade the U.S. because he was afraid there was going to be a gun behind every blade of grass. because we were a gun culture. Well, not that we've totally lost that, but we're not to the level that we used to be.
Yeah, you made me think of something I saw the other day, talking about a quote from Teddy Roosevelt. He was talking about how we needed to encourage the American public to the shooting sports, and we needed to encourage the building and maintenance of national shooting ranges around the country, and we've lost that.
People in this country are afraid of the gun. They don't understand it. They don't know anything about it. And when you have that fear of something and you don't know anything about it, it's hard to get past that until somebody helps you with it. And we need to kind of get back to that, where more of a grassroots educational, where the demystification of a firearm, so that people understand that, the difference between my AR-15 and my Ruger 10/22 22 rifle is all cosmetic. They both do the same thing. One's made of wood and steel. The other one's made of plastic and steel. But they're really both 22s. They really both do the same thing. But people don't understand that.
Right.
One of the other that I think needs to be looked at as part of the solution, at least in preventing terrorism, is for the government agencies to do a better job of investigating those possible threats. I think how much could have been prevented in Orlando if they would have followed up with the gun dealer who rejected the shooter who wanted to purchase body armor and bulk ammunition. What could have been accomplished if they had followed up with the complaint from Disney that they had this individual who was very suspicious?
Let law enforcement do their jobs.
Yeah, imagine that. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, it's, I'm not going to say that the police department I work for, but in the 15 years that I've been there, there has been more rules and regulations preventing us from doing our job. It's unbelievable. It's, it was funny when I started 15 years ago, the old guys used to say, "Oh, you can't do police work anymore," because compared to when they started 20 years earlier to then, you couldn't. But literally, I'm turning to that old guy going, "Oh, you young guys have no idea. You can't do what we used to do." And it really is. The law enforcement is the one that is wearing the handcuffs now. They're not putting the handcuffs on the bad guys. They're already wearing them.
Hopefully things will change, and all we can do is pray for the future of the country and keep on teaching and keep on sharing our love for the Second Amendment and for firearms and for our freedoms. Thank you all for taking a few minutes. Aaron Israel from Fundamental Defense, Sergeant Bill Silvia, Pastor John Bennett, our regular contributors to the show. Thank you for everything you do for the show every week, and thank you for taking part in today's roundtable and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Hey, you know what, Lloyd? I think if we can get every one of your listeners to get someone new to listen to your podcast, especially maybe this up-and-coming podcast, we will be sharing this information, getting that information out there, getting it to where people will start to, maybe see the light or something. Any little bit will help, and that's what we need to do.
Absolutely.
Amen to that.
Thanks again. I appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
You too.
And happy Father's Day, everybody.
Happy Father's Day.
Same to you.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for this very special episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Thank you to our contributors, Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense, Sergeant Bill Silvia, and Pastor John Bennett for their contributions to the show and for joining me for today's episode. And I thank you for taking the time to listen and to download and subscribe to the Armed Lutheran Radio podcast. I hope you will share this episode with your friends. Talk about it with your friends. There's a lot of great information here that I think if we could share it and discuss it and talk more openly about what we're really facing, we can make some changes in this country for the better. I hope you'll share this episode, and I hope you'll join us again next week on another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Christ's blessings. Keep shooting. Keep praying. We'll talk to you next week.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @Armed Lutheran and like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/TheArmedLutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.